Hey guys, welcome back to OrmsTV, and today myself and Deon will be shooting on 4 popular primes, mostly in sort of the wide to portrait range.
Yeah, and we are going to be shooting with the Canon EOS R5, and the 4 lenses we're going to be using is the 16mm, 35mm, 50mm and an 85mm, taking you guys through how the perspective changes when you shoot with these different lenses and just running you through what they're generally used for. So join us for that.
Now first up, there's a word you said, and that was perspective. Now perspective definitely changes when you use these lenses. Now 16mm, 35, 50 and 85, when you think about it, they are actually quite close to each other. But when we go through these images and show you some of the differences, the perspective definitely changes. And you might not buy every lens of those options. There might be 1 or 2 that you'll keep in your bag, or maybe even just 1, depending on your style of photography.
Yeah, so when you touch on perspective, a lot of it comes down to the amount of background information that's generally captured within your frame. And in a lot of cases, the item that you're shooting in the foreground will also change, but let's assume for the sake of this one experiment that the item that you're shooting in the foreground, in this case, André, stays roughly the same within your frame. Now, to get that effect, you would effectively be moving the point from which you are shooting backwards as you're going up in focal length. Now, in these 4 images that we're showing you right now, you can clearly see how the perspective shifts as you're moving essentially tighter with your focal length. So you're going from 16 to 35 to 50 to 85, and you'll see that the amount of information in the background drastically compresses as you go through those focal lengths. In addition to that, the perceived depth that you get within the frame also changes. And this is something that's very important when you decide on what type of lens you're purchasing for the type of photography that you would like to do. When you look at portrait lenses specifically, so right now, not necessarily a 16 or a 35mm, but if you look at the 2 images of the 50 and the 85, you can see how much the background compression changes just in those 2 focal lengths. When you look at the wider scope here, going from your 16 compared to your 85, if you put those 2 next to each other, the effect is drastic. And this is why you will generally find that your 50mm or your 85mm lenses, and even longer than that, traditionally a 105 or a 135, even a 200mm lens, very, very popular for portrait applications. And it is exactly for that background compression. And I think this example shows it perfectly.
Now that I feel perfectly sums up these 4 lenses in a nutshell, but I think we do need to maybe touch on these lenses individually. Now the 16mm, when you think of it, especially on a full frame camera, is quite wide. Now this 16mm we were shooting at f2.8, and a lot of these shots, if you think of a 16mm, the background might not be as blurry. But the cool thing that I find with wide angle lenses, the closer you are physically to your subject, the more blurry background you'll achieve. And there are some shots we did here on the beach where you can definitely get that effect. And that's what I love with wide angles, is getting very creative portrait shots. Yard, watch out for the edges will obviously distort, but you can definitely get some background separation if you pull the lens in closer to your subject. However, obviously, wide-angle lenses are generally made for landscape photography, so that's when you'll be shooting at f8 or f11, just to ensure that everything is nice and sharp in your shot.
Yeah, and when you do talk about a wide-angle lens, the one thing that you mentioned there is your potential for distortion. Now, if you take a step up from where we're shooting with the 16mm and you go to a 35mm, you get to a focal length that is perceived to be a very natural focal length. And generally speaking, you're going to find that most people would concede that somewhere between a 24mm and maybe as tight as about a 40mm would kind of be a very natural perspective based on the focal length of the human eye. And a 35 kind of fits into that little bracket perfectly. Now, for a lot of people, shooting at 35 might be considered a little bit boring, a little bit plain. But where a 35 comes into its own very, very nicely is when you are trying to get quite a natural perspective.
Yep.
Think of something like street photography, documentary photography, you know, even some wedding photography where you don't want perspectives blown out. You don't want distortion within your frame. You want a very natural, sort of easy viewing perspective to have. And that is really where something like a 35mm absolutely shines. It just looks natural.
Yeah, I do have to agree with that. I mean, my favorite lens, to be honest, is 35. So when I travel or shoot sort of documentary style, street style, that is really going to give you that natural perspective.
Now, within the 4 lenses that we're looking at here, the next step would be your more traditional portrait lenses. So your 50mm and your 85mm. Now, the 50mm kind of straddles that boundary between a portrait lens and a natural lens. A lot of people would still shoot street photography, documentary style photography with a 50mm lens. I myself am one of those people. I love a 50mm on my Leicas. It is a very pleasing focal length for me to shoot with. But when you take your 50mm and you punch in quite close on your subject matter, it becomes a very, very nice portrait lens, a very usable portrait option. I would still consider an 85 a better portrait lens, and you'll see within these images that we show you now, if we're shooting 2 images with a very similar framing and a very similar aperture opening, then you actually get very nice separation with your 85. You get a very, very pleasing bokeh within your background, and the 85 just stands a little bit apart as a more personal, focused portrait option.
Yeah, now I mean, back in the day when you used to get film cameras, it used to be bundled always with the 50mm. And I think the 50mm is kind of like one of that classic style lenses that is perfect for teaching someone how to frame. And a lot of people also say that a 50mm is kind of like that natural sort of human eye kind of look. It's the perfect lens for portraiture, but if I have to choose, to be honest, I prefer the compression of an 85. Because the 85 is going to give you a much better depth separation between the subject and the background, especially bokeh wise, dependent on the lens obviously. But I think in this comparison, I personally prefer the 85 for shooting those sort of tight, crispy portraits.
Yeah, so I've only got one question then. If you had to choose out of these 4 lenses, or these 4 focal lengths, if you had to pick 2, because let's be honest, most people won't have only 1 lens.
Yeah.
You know, so let's look at a 2 lens setup.
Okay.
What would you go for?
Again, like I said earlier, 35 is my go-to. Definitely one of the best sort of travel walk-around lenses. And then as well, like I just said now, 85. And that's a nice gap. You know, 35 is going to give you that sort of natural, sort of street style look. And then if you feel like you need more depth or separation, then 85. I even always tell my clients, getting a 35 and a 50 is maybe just too close. It's almost too similar, but not really. But 35 and 85 is a nice jump between each other, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to differ slightly because I personally shoot 90% of the time with a 50mm. I always recommend going for that 50 as a starting option. You know, sort of once you get out of that kit lens, you know, life, get yourself a 50. It's a beautiful lens to learn on. And then for me personally, I want to be a little bit more creative, and I'm not much of a portrait shooter, so I'd probably go for something quite wide. Generally, I'd be tempted by a 24, but to keep in line with what we're shooting with here, 50mm and a 16 for me, I think that's quite a nice setup.
And that's kind of like the beauty of these 4 lenses. Not one lens is perfect for everybody.
True.
Depending on your style, depending on your needs, there's a lens for everybody. And this kind of just proves it. That's it, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and let us know in the comments below which 2 of these 4 lenses you'll be getting.
Yeah guys, and if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, and if you enjoy the content that we put out, consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us out a lot. And until next time guys, cheers.